The candles in the ballroom windows threw gold across the gravel path, and somewhere beyond the glass, an orchestra was tuning itself into something that would later be called a waltz. Though right now it was only the sound of 40 instruments agreeing, slowly, to become one. Theodora stood just outside the light, close enough to hear the music, far enough not to be seen. That was the arrangement. Nobody had written it down. Nobody had to. It had been understood for years the way weather is understood, not agreed to, simply survived. Move. The word came from behind her, flat as a slap. Theodora didn't need to turn. She knew the voice the way she knew the sound of rain on glass. Something that had always been there. Something that had never once been kind. Lady Cassandra Winslow stood in the doorway, moonlight catching the diamonds at her throat. 3 admiring young men trailing behind her like ducklings who hadn't yet noticed the pond was frozen. "Move back," Cassandra said again, softer this time, which somehow made it worse. "Before someone sees you," Theodora lowered her eyes. Old habit, safer than looking up. "Father said I couldn't come inside," she said. "He never said I couldn't stand here." Cassandra's smile widened. That smile, the one that had charmed half the county and wounded the other half, usually in the same evening. "Don't make me repeat myself." She stepped closer. Close enough that Theodora could smell rosewater and something colder underneath it. "I only wanted to hear the music," Theodora said. "Music?" Cassandra laughed, and 2 of the young men laughed with her, though neither seemed to know why. "You're not missing the ball, Theodora. The ball is missing you. Do you understand the difference?" Theodora didn't answer. There was no answer that wouldn't just become another thing to laugh about. That was the arrangement too. One of the young men, kinder than the others, or simply less practiced at cruelty, glanced at her with something close to discomfort. Perhaps she only wanted, Cassandra interrupted smoothly, not even bothering to look at him, exactly what she always wants. To be looked at without having earned it. She smoothed the front of her gown, diamonds catching candlelight. There's a difference, you understand, between being seen and being stared at out of pity. My sister has never once managed to tell them apart. The young man said nothing further. Nobody ever did, once Cassandra had finished a sentence like that. Inside, the orchestra swelled. Somewhere past the doors, a name was announced, and the whole room seemed to lean toward it at once, like wheat bending in a single direction. Cassandra's head turned. Her eyes lit with something hungrier than diamonds. "He's here," she whispered. And just like that, Theodora didn't exist anymore. Which was, she thought, its own kind of mercy. She stepped back into the dark. She always did. 10 years earlier, in a room that smelled of lavender and fever, a much smaller Theodora had held her mother's hand and refused to believe what everyone else in the house already knew. 13 is too young, she whispered, to lose someone. Lady Rosamond Winslow smiled anyway, weak but real. 13 is exactly old enough, she said, to remember what I'm about to tell you. Outside the door, a maid was already whispering to another. Something about the eldest daughter. Something about her size, her softness, the shape of her that never seemed to match the shape her father wanted. Theodora hadn't understood, back then, why her mother's grip tightened at the sound. She had only understood that her mother's hand felt colder than it had that morning, and that the physician had stopped meeting anyone's eyes when he left the room, and that the whole house had begun moving in the hushed, careful way houses move when they already know something the family inside them hasn't yet said aloud. "Listen to me." Rosamond's fingers were cold. "There will be people, many of them, for the rest of your life who look at your face before they ever bother looking at your heart. Don't let them win, my darling. Don't ever let anyone convince you your heart is worth less than your face." Those were the last words Theodora ever heard her mother say out loud. Everything after that was just breathing, and then not long after, not even that. Not every wound in that house arrived in a single sentence, though. Some arrived slowly, in installments, spread across years, so quietly that no single moment ever felt large enough to protest on its own. There was an afternoon 3 years after the funeral, in the practice yard behind the stables, when Reginald 16 then, already the kind of tall that made grown men clear a path for him without quite meaning to, lowered his fencing foil and turned to find his sister watching from the fence rail. "You're getting much better," Theodora called, and meant it. Reginald wiped his brow, pleased with himself in the particular way boys that age always were, and crossed the yard toward her, foil still loose in one hand. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "When I inherit the title." He said it the way a boy announces a gift, entirely certain of his own generosity, entirely unaware he was holding a knife by the blade. "I'll have a cottage built, somewhere past the east gate. Small, but comfortable. Far enough that visitors won't need to know we're related." He meant it, as a kindness. That was the part Theodora would turn over in her mind for years afterward, that in his own head, at 16, he genuinely believed he was offering her something. A house of her own, safety of a sort. He simply hadn't understood, or hadn't wanted to, that the safety he pictured for her was built entirely out of distance. He said it lightly. He walked away before she could answer, already calling for his instructor to run the drill again, already forgetting the sentence the moment it left his mouth. Theodora stood at the fence a while longer, watching the foils flash in the afternoon light, and did not cry. She had stopped crying over sentences like that one, somewhere around her 14th birthday. She simply carried it, folded small, the way she carried most things in that house, and went inside to help Mrs. Bellwether with the evening bread, because flour and butter at least, never asked her to explain herself. 10 years is a long time to carry one sentence from a dying woman, and longer still, to carry a dozen's smaller ones from the living. Long enough that Theodora sometimes wondered if she'd remembered her mother's words exactly right, or if she'd simply repeated them so often in her own head that they'd worn smooth like a stone in a river. She was 23 now, old enough to know better than to still be standing outside ballroom doors. Except she never seemed to learn. She still caught herself, some mornings, studying her reflection a moment too long before turning away from it, not out of vanity, but out of the old habit of trying to see herself the way the rest of the house saw her, as if enough practice might eventually let her agree with them. It never worked. She simply looked like herself, round where the fashion plates were narrow, soft where they were sharp, and entirely, stubbornly alive in a way no amount of family disapproval had managed to starve out of her. Winslow Hall in late autumn looked like something out of a painting golden light, dying leaves, the kind of beauty that made visitors sigh the moment their carriage came up the drive. Nobody sighed over what happened inside it. Breakfast the next morning was the usual performance. Fresh bread, roasted meats, a table long enough to seat 12, though only 4 ever sat there, and Theodora always chose the chair farthest from the rest, as if distance might make her easier to forget. It usually did. Her father, Duke Bartholomew Winslow, read his correspondence without looking up. Her brother, Reginald, 19 now, and carrying himself like a man twice his age, buttered his toast with the concentration of someone avoiding conversation entirely. Cassandra broke the silence, the way she always did. "Father, should Theodora really be eating with us this morning?" Bartholomew folded his letter. "Where she eats," he said, not unkindly, which was somehow the cruelest part, "is unimportant. As long as it isn't where my guests might lose their appetite." Nobody laughed. That silence hurt more than laughter ever could. Theodora rose. "I wasn't very hungry anyway," she said, and carried her plate out before anyone could see her face change. The kitchen, at least, never asked her to be smaller than she was. Mrs. Bellwether, the head cook, took one look at her and set down a warm meat pie without a word. "You'll waste away," the old woman said, "if you keep lying like that." Theodora laughed despite herself, watery-eyed, disbelieving. "Nobody has ever once accused me of wasting away, Mrs. Bellwether." "Then prove them right," the cooks said by eating. For a few minutes, in that warm, flour-dusted room, Theodora felt something close to home. It never lasted. It never did. The rest of her mornings belonged to the estate itself, though no one had ever formally asked her to take them. She simply had, the way a person fills whatever space is left empty around them. She knew which tenant families had lost a child to fever the winter before. She knew the stable boy's mother was recovering slowly from a difficult birth, and she knew which of the kitchen maids sent half her wages home to a sister in the next county. Nobody had assigned her these facts. She had simply collected them, quietly, the way other young women her age collected invitations, because attention, she had learned long ago, was the one thing she was allowed to give away freely without anyone accusing her of reaching above her station. The family portrait was to be finished that week. A painter from the capital, 3 months' work. A canvas the size of a door leaned against the drawing room wall. Theodora had spent nights sewing her own dress, for it nothing grand, just a simple blue, but hers, made with her own hands, because no one had thought to order one for her. She smoothed it outside the drawing room door, took a breath, stepped inside. Sunlight poured through tall windows onto her father, her brother, her sister, all arranged like pieces on a chessboard that had already decided who mattered. The painter looked up, polite, professional. Your eldest daughter, your Grace? Bartholomew didn't even look at her. Leave her out. The room went very quiet. I beg your pardon? The painter said. The portrait is for visitors, 6 words. That was all it took. Theodora felt every servant in the room glance toward her and then quickly away, the way people look at a candle just before it goes out, embarrassed for it somehow. She forced a smile. It fooled no one, least of all herself. I understand, Father. She turned and walked out before the tears could reach her eyes, though they caught up with her somewhere around the second staircase. That portrait hung in Winslow Hall for years afterward. Every visitor admired it. The perfect family, 4 warm faces glowing in golden light. Only Theodora ever knew that someone had been painted out of it long before the brush touched canvas. She found the truth by accident, the way most truths seem to arrive. It was raining, the kind of gray afternoon that made the whole house feel smaller, and Theodora had gone up to the attic, looking for her mother's old shawl. Instead, she found dust sheets, broken furniture, and leaned against a rafter, forgotten a canvas she didn't recognize. She pulled the sheet away, an earlier version of the family portrait, rougher, unfinished in places, but there, standing beside her mother, a round-faced girl with her mother's same steady eyes. Herself, 13 years old, included. Theodora's hand trembled against the frame. Someone had ordered this painted over. Someone had decided, quietly, deliberately, that she didn't belong in her own family's memory of itself. And that meant the exclusion hadn't happened once, in a single cruel sentence over breakfast. It had happened years before that. In secret, on purpose, with enough forethought to commission an entirely new canvas, rather than simply crop an old one. She thought of every visitor who had ever stood in the drawing room admiring that painting. Every compliment paid to her father's fine family, his handsome son, his 2 lovely daughters, except there had only ever been one lovely daughter in the version anyone was permitted to see. She wondered how many of those compliments her father had accepted with a straight face, knowing exactly what he'd erased to earn them. She sat hard on an old trunk, canvas propped against her knees, and let herself cry the way she hadn't allowed since her mother's funeral. Not delicate tears, real ones, ugly, shaking, years-deep ones. Eventually she noticed something else tucked behind the frame, a small wooden box, and inside it, wrapped in yellowed cloth, her mother's locket. The one Theodora had worn every day since the funeral, except this one was different. Heavier, older. She turned it over in her hands. There was a second clasp on the back. Small, almost invisible, locked. She had never noticed it before. 10 years, and she had never once noticed. She tried her fingernail against the seam. Nothing. She tried a hairpin. Nothing. What are you hiding? She whispered to a piece of jewelry, which was, she realized, possibly the strangest sentence she had said out loud in her entire life. The locket didn't answer. Of course it didn't. But she didn't put it back in the box, either. She brought it down to the kitchen that evening, turning it over under Mrs. Bellwether's better light, hoping the old woman's decades in that house might know something Theodora didn't. Mrs. Bellwether held it a long moment, thumb tracing the hidden seam with the particular carefulness of someone handling a memory rather than an object. Your mother wore this every day I ever saw her, she said finally, long before you were born. I always assumed it was sentiment. A lock of hair, perhaps. Nothing more. There's a second clasp. Is there? The cook's eyes sharpened, just slightly. Your mother was a great deal more careful with her secrets than anyone in this house ever gave her credit for, my lady. If she locked something away, I'd wager she had good reason to. Do you know what it might be? Mrs. Bellwether handed the locket back, her expression unreadable. I know she stopped smiling properly the year before you were born and started again only once you'd arrived. Beyond that, I couldn't tell you. Some things a woman keeps even from her own kitchen staff. She turned back to her bread, and the conversation, clearly, was finished. Theodora climbed the stairs that night with more questions than she'd carried down them. News arrived 3 days later, carried by a breathless footman and a wax-sealed letter that made her father's face do something Theodora hadn't seen it do in years. Smile. Genuinely smile. "Prepare the ballroom," Bartholomew announced at dinner, practically vibrating with excitement. "The autumn ball will be held within the fortnight." Reginald sat up straighter. For what occasion? Their father set the letter down like it was made of gold. "Duke Leopold Ashworth," he said, "has accepted our invitation." The silence that followed wasn't the cruel kind. It was the stunned kind. Everyone at that table, everyone in that county, knew exactly who that name belonged to. The wealthiest bachelor in the kingdom. A man who had refused nearly every social invitation sent his way for the better part of 3 years. And now somehow, impossibly, he was coming here. Cassandra's whole face transformed. Theodora watched her sister's eyes light up like a woman who had just been handed the deed to her own future. "He's coming here," Cassandra breathed. "To this house." Bartholomew nodded, already calculating, already imagining the alliance, the connections, the whispered envy of every other family in the kingdom. Reginald allowed himself a rare, satisfied smile, already imagining, no doubt, the kind of introductions a brother-in-law like that could arrange for a young man's own prospects. The whole household hummed with a kind of electric excitement that Theodora had felt exactly twice before in her life, once for a royal visit, once for her sister's debut. Both times she had watched from a doorway. Both times she had understood, without needing to be told, that whatever was coming, it wasn't coming for her. She sat very still at the end of the table, the locket a small, secretive weight beneath her collar, and said nothing. She already knew how this story went. She had lived every chapter of it before. Whenever Winslow Hall celebrated something, there had never once been a place in it for her. And yet, that night, lying awake with the locket pressed against her palm, Theodora found herself doing something she hadn't done in a long time. She found herself hoping. Not for a dance. Not for a duke's attention, she wasn't foolish enough for that, whatever else she was. She hoped, simply, that for one evening, just one, she might stand close enough to the music to feel like she belonged to it. A small enough thing to want, she told herself firmly. Except small things in that house had a way of costing everything. In the 3 days that followed, the household transformed itself entirely. Floors were waxed until they threw back candlelight like still water. The good silver, kept locked away for exactly this sort of occasion, was polished by hands that would not be permitted anywhere near the ballroom once the guests arrived. Cassandra was fitted for a new gown twice, the modisti summoned from the capital at considerable expense, while Theodora mended the hem of the same blue dress she'd worn to the last 3 occasions she'd been allowed to observe from a doorway rather than attend. Nobody asked whether she needed a new dress. She hadn't expected them to. Outside her window, the first frost of the season was settling over the gardens, silver and quiet, and somewhere beneath the earth her mother had been buried in. 10 years of unspoken words waited to be understood. The ball was 3 days away, and whatever waited on the other side of it, Theodora Winslow had absolutely no idea it would change the rest of her life. The carriage wheels of House Ashworth crunched up the gravel drive just as the last violet light drained out of the sky. Inside, Duke Leopold Ashworth sat with his jaw tight and his patience thinner than the November air. He already knew how this evening would go. He'd lived it 100 times before, in 100 ballrooms exactly like this one. A mother would corner him, then another. Then a daughter would be presented like a prize horse at auction, all posture and polish and rehearsed laughter. And somewhere in all of it, not one single person would ask him a single true thing about himself. It was, he thought grimly, its own kind of loneliness. The kind money couldn't fix. The kind that got worse, somehow the wealthier he became. You could simply not go, his grandmother had said that morning, watching him dress with the amused patience of a woman who had buried one husband and outlived most of her opinions of high society. "I gave my word. You gave your word to attend. Nobody said you had to enjoy it." Leopold had almost smiled at that. Almost. Why this house, though, grandmother? Of all the invitations I've refused this year, why did you push me toward this one? Henrietta had only adjusted his cravat, humming something non-committal, the way she always did when she knew far more than she intended to say. Call it an old woman's curiosity, she'd said. Now go. And Leopold try, just once, to look past the daughter they put in front of you. He hadn't understood what she meant. Not yet. The ballroom, when he entered it, was exactly as he'd expected. Gold light, 100 candles, an orchestra working too hard to be heard over the noise of ambition dressed up as conversation. Conversation stopped the moment he crossed the threshold, the way it always did. He'd stopped finding it flattering years ago. Before he'd taken 3 full steps, a woman in emerald silk planted herself directly in his path, towing a pale, silent girl behind her like a reluctant kite. Your Grace, my daughter has studied under the finest tutors in the capital. She speaks 3 languages, plays the harp beautifully, and has never once embarrassed this family. Leopold studied the girl for a moment. She stared at her own shoes. Remarkable, he said. If I ever decide to collect accomplishments instead of a wife, I'll know precisely where to find you. A ripple of awkward laughter moved through the nearby guests. The mother's smile curdled at the edges. Before he could take another step, a second mother replaced her. Then a third. My daughter has refused 4 proposals already. My daughter is considered the greatest beauty in 3 counties. My daughter, my daughter, my daughter! Leopold closed his eyes for exactly 1 breath. Every conversation sounded the same. Every mother believed her own daughter was the exception. Every daughter smiled the exact smile she'd been drilled to produce. Not one of them had spoken a single word for herself. Across the room, Duke Bartholomew Winslow beamed like a man showing off the crown jewels, one hand resting proudly on the shoulder of a strikingly beautiful young woman in ice blue silk. Lady Cassandra Winslow. Leopold had heard the name whispered at least 6 times since walking through the door. He didn't need 6 more. If you'll excuse me, he said to no one in particular, already moving, I find myself in urgent need of air. Nobody stopped him. It was frankly the first pleasant surprise of the evening. The garden beyond the terrace doors was dark and blessedly quiet, the cold air a relief against the heat and noise he'd just escaped. Leopold loosened his cravat, exhaled hard, and let his shoulders drop for the first time in hours. At last, then a voice, low, urgent, definitely not aimed at him. No, 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 don't you dare fall. He turned toward the sound, toward the shadow of the kitchen wing, where a young woman stood balanced, precariously, atop an overturned crate, one arm stretched through an open window, the other holding what looked like a folded napkin. Almost there, the crate wobbled. She yelped, grabbed something from the sill, and half fell, half leapt backward onto the grass, clutching the bundle to her chest like it was made of glass. I meant to do that, she announced to absolutely no one. I admire your priorities, Leopold said. She froze. Slowly, very slowly, she turned around. The smile dropped clean off her face. Standing 3 feet away, arms folded, faintly amused, was a man she clearly recognized and clearly hadn't expected to be caught by. Neither of them spoke for a moment. She looked at him, then at the bundle in her arms, then back at him. If you're going to report me to someone, she said finally, would you at least let me deliver this first? That wasn't the answer he'd expected. It was, he was beginning to realize, becoming something of a pattern with this particular evening. Deliver it, he repeated. Not eat it? It's not for me. She lifted the napkin slightly, as if to prove it. One of the kitchen maids has been running a fever since this morning. Nobody upstairs has noticed she's missing. I doubt anyone will. Something in his chest shifted quietly, without permission. You climbed out a window, he said, in the middle of your own family's ball, to bring soup to a sick maid. Bread, actually, and a bit of cheese. She lifted her chin, a small defiance in it. And I'd do it again. So if you intend to make something of it. I don't. That stopped her. You don't? No. He almost smiled. Almost. I find it, if anything, the first honest thing I've witnessed all evening. She studied him for a long moment, wary, like she wasn't sure whether to trust the sentence or brace against whatever came after it. In her experience, he could see it plainly on her face. Kindness from strangers usually came with a hook buried somewhere inside it. You're not from the household staff, she said slowly. Are you a guest who got lost? Something like that. Which means you should probably go back before someone important notices you're gone. Probably, he agreed, and didn't move. She laughed a real laugh, surprised out of her, quickly covered. You're a strange sort of guest, I've been told worse. A silence settled between them, not an uncomfortable one. The kind that happens when two people, without meaning to, have accidentally found the only honest conversation in the building. Tell me something, he said eventually. If every door in this kingdom opened for you tomorrow, what would you choose? She didn't hesitate. To be seen, she said, not looked at. Seen. No jewels, no grand title? I already have a title. It's never once kept anyone from looking straight through me. He studied her more carefully then. Not her face, though it was a kind face, open in a way he wasn't used to, but something underneath it. A steadiness. As if she'd been knocked down often enough to stop being afraid of the ground. And you? She asked. What would you choose? He gave a short, dry laugh. One evening where someone tries to marry me before they've bothered learning my name. She tilted her head, considering that with unexpected seriousness. That sounds fixable. Oh? You clearly need to stop attending balls where you're the only interesting thing in the room. That startled a real laugh out of him, loud enough that she flinched, glancing back toward the house as if worried it might summon someone. Careful, she said, half smiling despite herself. Someone might hear you enjoying yourself. They'll think the evening's gone terribly wrong. It has, he said in the best possible way. She sat down on the low stone wall beside the crate she'd nearly broken her neck on, tucking her skirts beneath her with the easy unself-consciousness of a woman who had long since stopped performing for anyone. May I ask you something impertinent? You've already asked me several things. I don't imagine one more will ruin the evening. Why did you actually come tonight? Every mother in that ballroom seems convinced you've refused every invitation sent to you for the better part of 3 years. And yet here you are. He considered the question longer than she expected. My grandmother asked me to. Which isn't an answer, I realize, since she rarely explains her reasons for anything. She simply implied I might regret not coming. And do you? Regret it? Ask me again in an hour, he said, once I've gone back inside and remembered why I left in the first place. Theodora laughed, and the sound surprised her unguarded, easy, nothing like the careful, measured laugh she'd trained herself to produce around her own family. You could simply not go back in. I could. Though I imagine a duke wandering his host's gardens all evening might eventually draw more attention than the ballroom itself. Then go back in, she said, and be exactly as unimpressed as you were the first time. It seems to suit you. Is that a professional recommendation? A personal one. I've had a great deal of practice being unimpressive at balls. I could teach a course, if there were any demand for it. He looked at her for a long moment then, something shifting behind his expression that she couldn't quite name. I doubt that very much, he said quietly, and didn't explain further, and she didn't ask him to. Neither of them noticed, in that moment, the flicker of pale silk near the terrace doors, a figure standing very still behind a marble column, watching two strangers laugh together in the dark like the rest of the world didn't exist. The bundle was gone, quietly delivered through the kitchen door by the time she returned to where he stood waiting, arms still faintly crossed, watching her with something unreadable. You never told me your name, he said. She hesitated, just slightly, long enough that he noticed. Theodora, she said finally. Winslow, he went very still. Winslow. This was the Winslow ball. Somewhere inside that overbright ballroom, a duke had spent the entire evening presenting one particular daughter as though she were the only one in existence, which meant the woman standing in front of him, flowers still faintly dusted on her sleeve, cheeks flushed from climbing through a window to feed a sick servant girl. Nobody else remembered existed, was the daughter nobody had bothered to mention. You're his eldest, Leopold said slowly. Something closed behind her eyes. A shudder, practiced, immediate. I should get back inside, she said, before someone notices I'm gone. Or worse, before someone notices I was ever anywhere to begin with. Theodora. She paused. I don't know your name either, she said, not quite looking at him. You never gave it. He almost told her right then. Almost let the whole evening tip forward into whatever it was becoming. Except a footman's voice rang out from the terrace, announcing something, and the moment folded itself shut before either of them could finish it. "Another time," he said instead. She looked at him a beat longer than necessary. Then she turned and walked back toward the light, back into the house that had never once made room for her, leaving him standing alone in the cold with a name he couldn't stop turning over in his mind. Theodora Winslow. He'd come to this ball expecting nothing. He was leaving it, he realized with something close to alarm, already thinking about how quickly he could see her again. The 2 days between the ball and Leopold's arrival passed at Winslow Hall the way a held breath passes slowly, and with considerable effort not to let it show. Bartholomew spent them in a state of barely contained triumph, drafting and redrafting the letter he intended to send to half the peerage the moment the engagement was official, rehearsing the modest, gracious tone he planned to adopt when congratulated on securing the match of the season for his younger daughter. Cassandra, for her part, had new gowns fitted, new jewelry sent for, entirely certain the only remaining question was which specific words Leopold would use when he finally called. Only Theodora, moving quietly through her usual mornings among the tenant cottages and the kitchen accounts, said nothing to anyone. She hadn't decided whether the garden conversation had been real, or whether she'd simply wanted it badly enough to imagine more into it than had actually been there. Hope, she'd learned, was a dangerous thing to trust in that house. It rarely survived contact with breakfast. 2 days later, Winslow Hall's drawing room was arranged for a very different kind of announcement, though only Duke Bartholomew seemed entirely certain what it would be. "Your Grace." Bartholomew rose the moment Leopold was shown in, beaming, already reaching for a decanter. "I confess I'd hoped you might call again. I trust you found the ball to your liking?" "More than I expected," Leopold said. "Excellent, excellent." Bartholomew poured 2 glasses without asking. "My daughter speaks of nothing else. I imagine you'll want to discuss." "I've come to request permission," Leopold said, "to marry your eldest daughter." The decanter stopped halfway to the glass. The room went very quiet. "I beg your pardon, Lady Theodora," Leopold said. "I'd like your blessing to marry her." Bartholomew set the decanter down slowly, as though the sentence needed a moment to finish landing before he could trust his own hands again. "You cannot possibly mean, I do. My eldest daughter has never in her life received a single proposal, Your Grace, and now you arrive asking for her specifically, as though—" He stopped. Started again. "Forgive me. Is this some manner of jest? I don't jest about marriage." The study door opened before Bartholomew could recover. Cassandra swept in, a tea tray balanced in her hands, already smiling the smile she'd clearly rehearsed for this exact meeting. "Father, I thought perhaps His Grace would like." She caught the last of the sentence hanging in the air, watched her father's face, watched Leopold's. "I'm sorry," she said slowly. "I must have misheard something." "You didn't," Leopold said, not unkindly. "You came here for me. I came here for Lady Theodora." The tray slipped. Porcelain shattered across the floor in a bright, brutal crash. Tea spreading dark across the pale rug like something spilling that could never quite be gathered back up. "No," Cassandra whispered, not loud, which somehow made it worse. "No, that isn't you danced with me. You spoke with me. I spoke with you for exactly as long as manners required," Leopold said gently as he could manage. "I spent an hour in the garden with your sister. I've thought of little else since." Cassandra stood frozen amid the broken china, and for the first time in her life, Theodora, who had just stepped into the doorway, drawn by the sound of shattering porcelain, watched her sister's perfect composure crack straight down the middle. Their eyes met across the ruined tea tray. Cassandra's face did something Theodora had never once seen it do before. It looked for just a moment afraid. Then the mask slid back into place, cool and immaculate, and Cassandra turned and swept from the room without another word, heels clicking sharp against the floor like punctuation on a sentence nobody had finished writing. In the corridor beyond, 2 housemaids pressed themselves against the wall to let her pass. Exchanging a glance the moment her back was turned, the particular glance servants reserve for the instant a household's entire order of importance rearranges itself in front of them. By evening, every member of staff at Winslow Hall would know exactly what had happened in that study. By the following week, so would the county. Bartholomew stared at his eldest daughter standing in the doorway as though seeing her for the first time in a decade. "Theodora," he said, her name unfamiliar in his own mouth. "Did you know about this?" "No," she said honestly. "I only knew his hands in the dark, holding a plate steady while I climbed through a window." Leopold crossed the room toward her, and for once, in a house built entirely on appearances, nobody in it was watching either of them for how they looked. They were simply, finally, watching them. "Lady Theodora Winslow," Leopold said quietly, taking her hand as though it were something rare, something he had no intention of ever setting down again. "Will you marry me?" Outside, the last of the autumn light was fading fast over the gardens where they'd met, 2 days and a lifetime ago. Theodora looked at him for a long moment, searching, she would later admit, for the hook she was so certain must be hidden somewhere in all of this. Every kindness she'd ever been shown by someone outside that kitchen had come with a price attached sooner or later. A favor remembered, a debt called in, a softness that turned out eventually to be pity wearing a nicer coat. She waited for it. The catch, the moment his expression would flicker into something calculating, something that revealed the real reason a duke would choose the daughter. Nobody wanted over the daughter everybody did. It didn't come. He simply stood there, holding her hand, waiting for her answer, with the patience of a man who had already decided he could wait considerably longer than a moment, if a moment was what she needed. She never found the hook. "Yes," she said, and for the first time in 10 years, standing in a house that spent a decade teaching her she didn't belong in it, Theodora Winslow believed, just a little, that she finally might. Bartholomew recovered his voice before either of them had reached the door. "Naturally," he said, already smoothing the front of his waistcoat, already rehearsing, Theodora suspected, the version of this story he intended to tell the county. "We shall want to discuss the settlement terms at once. A union of this significance deserves proper documentation." Leopold glanced at him, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "There will be documentation," he said evenly. "I insist upon it, in fact. But the terms will be between myself and my wife, not her father." Bartholomew blinked, clearly unaccustomed to being excluded from a negotiation involving his own household, and said nothing further. It was, Theodora would think later, the first time in her life she had ever watched her father lose an argument simply by being denied the chance to have one. Word of the engagement reached the county before the ink on the betrothal announcement had properly dried. Some called it the strangest match anyone could remember. A few, more generous, called it romantic. Most simply repeated the story to whoever would listen, embellishing it a little further each time, until the version circulating by the following Sunday bore only a passing resemblance to a cake, a window, and 2 strangers who had simply told each other the truth in the dark. Theodora paid the gossip no attention at all. She had spent 23 years being talked about by people who had never once bothered to speak to her directly. She saw no reason to start caring what they said now, when for the first time in her life, someone actually had. The wedding itself was small, quiet, in the way arrangements are quiet when no one quite knows what to call what's actually happening between 2 people. There had been, in the final week before the ceremony, exactly 1 piece of paperwork neither of them had spoken of to anyone else. Leopold had drafted it himself, alone in his study, and presented it to her the evening before the wedding, with none of the ceremony he'd later use to ask for her hand a second time. "A year," he'd said, sliding the document across the desk toward her. "That's the term. If, at the end of it, either of us wishes to dissolve the arrangement, the document provides for it cleanly. No scandal beyond what a quiet annulment requires. No claim on you beyond what you'd want for yourself." Theodora had read it twice, understanding, even as she read, that he was offering her something most men in his position would never think to offer a wife at all: an exit. A door left deliberately unlocked, in case the whole arrangement turned out to be exactly the transaction society already assumed it was. "You're offering me a way out before we've even begun," she'd said. "I'm offering you the truth," he'd said, "which is that I don't yet know what this will become. Neither do you. I'd rather we both entered it honestly than pretend otherwise in front of a priest." She had signed it. So had he, and neither of them had mentioned it again. No lingering glances at the ceremony itself. No whispered promises. Just vows, spoken plainly, and Leopold offering his arm afterward, like a man closing a business transaction rather than beginning a marriage. "Shall we go home, Your Grace?" Theodora placed her hand on his arm. "Home," she repeated, testing the word the way you test ice before stepping onto it. She'd never actually had one. Not really. Not one that wanted her in it. Ashworth Manor's staff lined both sides of the entrance when the carriage arrived, and Theodora watched their faces do the thing every new servant's face did: polite confusion, quickly buried, when the kingdom's wealthiest duke stepped down beside a woman who was not, by any measure society had taught them, the prize they'd expected him to bring home. She stopped before the threshold, looked at the elderly butler, standing stiff in the cold. "You've been out here waiting for us," she said. "I'm terribly sorry. Please, everyone, inside, before you catch your deaths on my account." The butler blinked. Just once. No duchess, in his 40 years of service, had ever once apologized to the staff for existing. Within 2 weeks, nobody in that house called her the new duchess anymore. They called her ours. The marriage itself settled into something neither of them had quite planned for. There was no grand romance in those first weeks, no declarations exchanged over candlelight, only small, accumulating kindnesses that neither of them commented on directly. Leopold began waiting for her at breakfast rather than starting without her, a habit he claimed was simple courtesy, and which Theodora noticed, without saying so, had never once been his habit before her arrival. She began leaving books he might enjoy on the table beside his favorite chair, chosen from his own library with the careful attention of a woman who paid closer notice to people than she let on. Neither of them spoke of the contract folded away in his desk drawer. It simply sat there, a quiet formality. Neither one felt any particular urgency to revisit, the way a person might keep an umbrella by the door without checking the weather every morning to see if they'd need it. January bled into February, February into the long gray stretch of a northern spring, and Theodora spent those months the way she'd always spent her time when nobody was watching to criticize her for it noticing things. She noticed the kitchen prepared 3 separate dinners each night, one for guests, one for senior staff, one for junior staff, nearly half of it thrown out by morning. She noticed the household's oil expenses running almost double what a neighboring estate of the same size should require. And she noticed, on a wet Tuesday morning, going through the ledgers alone in the study, a set of numbers that simply did not add up. It was, she would later say, the moment everything really began. Rent collected from the tenant farms, rent recorded in the books, 2 different figures, consistently, for years. She sat very still for a long moment, staring at the columns, doing the arithmetic twice, because surely she'd made some foolish error. She hadn't. Someone had been skimming from the tenants for at least 6 years, small enough each time that no single farmer would notice the shortfall in what reached the estate, large enough added together to have quietly stolen a small fortune. Her hands went cold around the ledger. This wasn't oil lamps. This wasn't wasted supper. This was families, actual families, with actual children, working actual land, being told their harvest had come up short again and again, while someone in this very house pocketed the difference. She closed the book, sat with it a moment. Then she did something that would have made her father choke on his tea. She went to find the steward herself. Mr. Aldous Fenn had managed the Ashworth accounts for 11 years, and he greeted the new duchess in his office with a particular blend of courtesy and condescension reserved for pretty young wives who wandered somewhere they didn't belong. "Your Grace?" He rose, smiling thin. "Is there something you require? I'm happy to have a maid explain the household schedule if the accounts have confused you." "They haven't confused me at all, Mr. Fenn." She set the ledger on his desk, open to the page. "I find them remarkably clear." His smile didn't move, but something behind his eyes did. "The tenant rents from Millbrook Farm," she said. "Recorded here as £42. The receipt in the estate office, which I retrieved myself this morning, states 51. Silence. "I imagine," she continued, "that if I compare every receipt against every ledger entry for the past 6 years, I'll find the same pattern. Am I wrong?" Fenn's jaw worked once. Twice. "Your Grace, there are complexities to estate accounting that—" "There are," she agreed, "and theft isn't one of them." He went very pale. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. There was something in her stillness, something she'd learned, she realized, from years of being talked over at her own family's table that made shouting entirely unnecessary. "You have 3 days," she said, "to return what's owed to Millbrook Farm and every tenant on this list. After that, I bring this ledger to my husband, and I imagine his patience for theft runs considerably shorter than mine." Fenn's composure finally cracked. "Your Grace, I have a wife, children. If this becomes known, then it shouldn't have started 6 years ago," Theodora said, not unkindly, but without giving an inch either. "I'm not offering you mercy because I doubt what you've done. I'm offering it because ruining you publicly would take longer than simply fixing what you broke, and I'd rather those families had their money back this season than have the satisfaction of watching you humiliated next season. Choose quickly. The offer expires with the 3 days." He chose quickly. Fenn left Ashworth Manor 11 days later. Quietly, without fuss, a settlement of stolen wages returned to 6 tenant families who never fully understood why their rent suddenly balanced itself out. Leopold found out only after it was already finished. "You handled an 11-year embezzlement," he said slowly, standing in the study doorway over breakfast. "Alone, without telling me. I told you now, after it was resolved. Would you have preferred I bothered you with it unfinished?" He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression she hadn't quite seen from him before, not surprise, exactly. Recognition. "No," he admitted. "I don't think I would have." It was around that same time that Dowager Duchess Henrietta Ashworth began appearing at breakfast more frequently than strictly necessary. 74 years old, sharp as a blade left too long in salt water, Henrietta had spent the better part of a decade being quietly excluded from decisions in her own former household the way age, she'd learned, made people assume you'd already stopped having useful opinions. She recognized something in Theodora almost immediately. "They looked past you your whole life because of your size," Henrietta said one afternoon, watching Theodora go over estate correspondence with the same fierce focus she brought to everything. "They look past me now because of my age. Funny, isn't it? How people decide what a person's worth before they've bothered asking." "Funny," Theodora agreed. "Isn't quite the word I'd choose." Henrietta almost smiled at that. "No," she said. "I don't suppose it is." They became something neither of them had quite expected. Not merely family by marriage, something closer to allies. 2 women the world had underestimated for entirely different reasons, comparing notes on exactly how wrong the world had been. Henrietta taught her which lords could be trusted at a negotiating table and which ones smiled widest right before they cheated you. She taught her how to read a room full of strangers in under a minute, and how to make herself immovable in an argument without ever once raising her voice. Theodora, in turn, taught Henrietta something the old woman hadn't expected to learn again at 74, that it wasn't too late to be listened to. That an opinion, offered plainly and without apology, still carried weight, even from a woman the rest of the household had quietly begun treating as decorative. "My own sons used to finish my sentences for me," Henrietta admitted one evening, watching the fire rather than Theodora, "as though I'd simply run out of things worth saying once I passed 60. Leopold never did it. I sometimes wonder if that's why I pushed him toward your father's ball in the first place. I'd heard enough about his eldest daughter from a groom who used to work these stables. Of all people, before he married a girl from your father's village, to suspect she might understand something about being spoken over. You knew about me. Before the ball, I knew a little," Henrietta admitted. "Enough to be curious. Not enough to have arranged anything, if that's what you're asking. I've never been quite that meddling, whatever my grandson might tell you." A faint, private smile. "Though I confess, I've rarely been so pleased to be right about a hunch." Except peace, Theodora was learning, never lasted particularly long in her life. It hadn't at Winslow Hall. It wasn't about to start now. The rumor arrived the way rumors always did, sideways, through someone else's servant, repeated at a tea party Theodora hadn't even attended. Lady Delphine Harcourt had wanted Leopold Ashworth for herself, since before Theodora had ever climbed through a kitchen window. 3 seasons of careful positioning, undone in a single autumn evening by a duke's daughter nobody had bothered to warn her about. Delphine did not take that gracefully. She had spent those 3 seasons the way ambitious women of her station always did, cultivating exactly the right friendships, appearing at exactly the right gatherings, positioning herself so precisely in Leopold's orbit that half the county had already begun referring to her, quietly, as the future Duchess of Ashworth, long before any actual proposal existed to justify the title. She had built an entire future on the assumption of an outcome. And then a duke's daughter nobody had thought to invite properly into society had somehow, in the space of a single evening, made that entire future disappear. It was, Theodora would later understand, less about Leopold specifically and more about the unbearable fact of having been overlooked by a woman's society had already decided didn't count. Delphine could have absorbed losing to a great beauty. Losing to Theodora Winslow, she apparently could not. By April, the story moving through drawing rooms across the county had grown teeth. Theodora, it was whispered, had schemed her way into the marriage, deliberately had known exactly who Leopold was that first night in the garden, had staged the whole encounter to trap a wealthy duke into an engagement before he could think better of it. It reached Theodora secondhand, the way cruelty about you always seems to travel faster than kindness ever does. She stood very still when Henrietta told her, in the drawing room, late afternoon light slanting gold across the carpet. "They're saying I planned it," Theodora said slowly. "That I knew who he was. She stopped. Started again. That I trapped him. Gossip," Henrietta said. "Invented by a woman who lost something she believed belonged to her. It doesn't matter who invented it. It's spreading." Theodora's hands had gone cold. An old, familiar chill. She recognized instantly the exact feeling of standing outside a ballroom door, being discussed by people who'd already decided who she was before she'd said a single word. Old wounds didn't stay closed. They just waited quietly for the right knife. She found Leopold in his study that evening, the ledgers pushed aside, his face already grim before she'd said a word. "You've heard," he said. "I take it you have too. 3 letters today alone." He held one up Lady Delphine's own careful hand, elegant and venomous in equal measure, addressed to a Countess Theodora had never met, full of insinuation dressed up as concern. "She's been thorough." Theodora braced herself. This was the part she knew this part, had lived this exact moment before, at her own family's breakfast table, in her own father's study, the part where someone she trusted decided the rumor was easier to believe than she was. "I need you to know," she started, "that none of it is." "Theodora." He stood, crossed the room, took both her hands before she could finish the sentence she'd clearly braced herself to defend. "I don't need convincing." She blinked. "You don't?" "I watched you climb out a window to feed a sick maid. Nobody else remembered existed," he said. "I've watched you handle an 11-year theft with more composure than most men twice your age. I know precisely who you are, madam. A jealous woman's letters don't change a single fact I've already seen with my own eyes." Something in Theodora's chest loosened, slow and unfamiliar, like a knot she hadn't realized she was still holding. "Most husbands," she said quietly, "would at least want to ask." "I'm not most husbands," he said it simply, which somehow made it land harder than any grand declaration could have. "So what do we do?" she asked. "We do," he said, "exactly what you did with Fen. We find the truth. And then we make certain everyone else sees it too." She studied him a moment, still faintly disbelieving of her own good fortune, the way she suspected she might go on being disbelieving for years yet, out of old habit if nothing else. "You could have simply believed the easier story," she said quietly. "Most men in your position would have. It would have cost you considerably less. Perhaps." He didn't look away from her. "But I find I've grown rather attached to the harder one. It happens to be true for one thing, and it happens to involve you for another, which I've discovered. I'm no longer willing to trade for anything simpler." It wasn't a grand declaration. He didn't intend it as one. But Theodora carried the sentence with her for the rest of that evening regardless, turning it over the way she'd once turned over her mother's locket, searching for the seam, the hidden catch, the place where the sentiment might reveal itself to be less than it seemed. She never found one there either. They found it in early May, and it was Theodora, not Leopold, not some conveniently placed witness who noticed the detail that unraveled everything. Delphine Harcourt was clever, But cleverness, Theodora had learned from years of watching people underestimate her, often made a person careless in exactly the places they assumed no one would think to look. The letters circulating through the county all repeated the same phrase, nearly word for word, a claim that Theodora had arranged the encounter through a bribed footman, a detail specific enough to sound credible, vague enough that no one had bothered to check it. Except Theodora had once spent an entire evening in that exact garden. She knew precisely which footman had been posted at which door, and there had been no footman posted at the kitchen exit that night at all. She'd climbed through a window specifically because the door was locked. She brought this calmly, methodically, to Henrietta. There was no footman, Theodora said, which means whoever wrote this either invented the detail from nothing or heard it from someone who wasn't actually there. Henrietta finished, eyes sharpening with the particular delight of a woman who'd just found the thread she needed to pull. Leave that with me, my dear. I still know exactly which of Lady Delphine's own maids owes me a favor. 2 days later, Henrietta produced a signed statement from a former Harcourt housemaid, dismissed the previous winter, deeply unhappy about it, and entirely willing to confirm that Lady Delphine had spent 3 evenings drafting and revising the very letters now circulating through the county's finest drawing rooms. The maid, a young woman named Sally Pruitt, had given her account willingly once Henrietta found her dismissed from Harcourt House the previous winter over some minor infraction. Delphine hadn't bothered to remember accurately, and still smarting from the unfairness of it. She described the winter evenings clearly. Lady Delphine at her writing desk long past midnight, 3 separate drafts of the same accusation, muttering the phrase about the bribed footman aloud to herself, more than once while she perfected the wording, entirely unaware a housemaid, stoking the fire in the corner, was listening to every word. She never once thought to lower her voice. For me, Sally told Henrietta, with the particular bitterness of someone who has spent years being treated as furniture. I don't suppose it occurred to her that furniture remembers things. Theodora held the statement in her hands and felt something settle inside her chest. Steady. Certain. This is enough, she said. More than enough, Henrietta agreed. The question now is simply how you'd like to use it. Theodora looked up, and there was something new in her expression. Not fear. Not the old flinch of a girl who'd learned to make herself smaller. Something closer to resolve. Quietly wouldn't teach anyone anything, she said slowly. Would it? Henrietta's mouth curved, slow and satisfied, like a woman watching a student finally arrive at the answer she'd been waiting for all along. No, she said. I don't imagine it would. An invitation arrived within the week, a grand ball, hosted by the crown's own steward, the kind of gathering half the kingdom's nobility would attend regardless of the season. Theodora turned it over in her hands twice before she let herself believe what it offered her. This is the room, Henrietta said, watching her turn the gold-embossed card over a 3rd time. If you mean to do this properly. I do. Then you understand there's no undoing it once it's done. Half the peerage will be under one roof. Whatever happens, there will be the version of this story everyone remembers, regardless of what's actually true. Theodora set the invitation down carefully, like something that might still change its mind. I've spent my whole life being undone quietly, she said, by other people, in private, where no one had to watch it happen and no one had to answer for it. She looked up. This time, everyone watches. Henrietta's mouth curved, slow and proud, the way a woman smiles when she's watched someone become exactly who she suspected they already were. Good girl, she said softly, then catching herself, good Duchess. Forgive me. Old habits. Theodora laughed, and for a moment the fear in her chest loosened enough to breathe around. Courage, she was learning, didn't arrive instead of fear. It simply showed up alongside it, uninvited, and asked her to walk forward anyway. That night, alone in his study long after the house had gone quiet, Leopold found himself standing before the drawer where the marriage contract still lived, untouched since the evening he'd first drafted it. He hadn't opened that drawer in months. He wasn't entirely certain, afterward, what had made him open it that particular night, whether it was Delphine's letters, or the ball invitation waiting downstairs, or simply the accumulated weight of a winter and a spring spent watching his wife become someone he could no longer imagine his life without. He unfolded the paper, read his own handwriting from a year no, less than a year, though it felt like a different lifetime, younger, colder, careful to leave every door open in case either of them needed to walk back out one of them. He didn't need any of those doors anymore. He wasn't certain he ever truly had. He carried the contract to the fireplace and fed it to the flames without ceremony, watching the paper curl and blacken and disappear, and felt something in his own chest loosen along with it, the last formal proof that what he felt for his wife had ever needed a legal document to justify itself. He said nothing to her about it the next morning. Some things, he was beginning to understand, didn't need to be announced to be true. Theodora found the ash in the hearth 2 days later, sweeping past the study on her way to breakfast, and said nothing about it either. She simply understood, looking at it, exactly what had burned, and exactly why, and carried the knowledge with her quietly for the rest of that day, like a small, warm stone in her pocket. The ballroom that night glittered the way, only rooms full of people, pretending not to gossip ever could. Chandeliers threw gold across silk and jewels. An orchestra worked hard to be heard over 300 conversations, most of which, Theodora suspected, were quietly about her. She found Lady Delphine Harcourt near the refreshment table, laughing at something a young Viscount had said, radiant, untouchable, utterly certain her carefully drafted letters had done exactly what she intended. Theodora crossed the room alone. Leopold stayed back, near the doors, close enough to reach her, far enough to let this belong entirely to her. That had been her one condition. Not his defense. Hers, Lady Harcourt. Theodora's voice carried further than she expected. Several nearby conversations quieted on instinct, the way a room does when it senses something is about to happen. Delphine turned, composure sliding smoothly into place. Your Grace. What a surprise, is it? Theodora tilted her head. I'd have thought, given how thoroughly you've been discussing me all spring, you might have expected we'd speak eventually. A few heads turned, then a few more. I don't know what you mean, Delphine said, smiling, though something behind her eyes had gone very still. The letters, Theodora said simply. The ones describing a bribed footman at my husband's garden door. The footman who, as it happens, was never posted there that evening at all. She let that sit a moment. Which I only know because I climbed through the window myself. There was no door to bribe anyone through. Delphine's laugh came a half-second too late. Servants gossip, Your Grace. I hardly control what stories. You wrote them. Theodora's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. In your own hand. Over 3 evenings this past winter, the orchestra faltered, just slightly, as more of the room turned to watch. That's an extraordinary accusation, Delphine said, color rising in her cheeks now, to make in front of. It isn't an accusation. Theodora reached into the small clutch at her wrist and withdrew a folded paper. It's a signed statement. From a housemaid you dismissed last winter. Who watched you write every single one? Silence, the true kind, spread outward from that spot like water finding the low places in a floor. Delphine's eyes darted toward the paper, then toward the crowd now fully assembled around them, then finally uselessly toward the doors, as if she might simply leave the entire situation behind her. You cannot possibly believe, she said, voice cracking at the edges, that anyone will take the word of a dismissed servant over. I don't need them to take her word. Theodora's voice was gentle now, which somehow made it worse. I only needed them to hear it. What they believe next is entirely their own business. She turned before Delphine could answer, before the woman's carefully built composure could reassemble itself into some new defense, and walked back through a crowd that parted for her the way it never once had at her own father's house. This was not revenge. She'd promised herself that walking in. This was simply the truth, finally permitted to stand in a room bright enough that no one could pretend not to see it. Leopold met her at the edge of the crowd, his hand finding hers without a word. You didn't need me at all, he murmured. Something like awe threaded through it. No, she agreed, but I'm glad you were there anyway. Behind them, Delphine Harcourt stood alone amid a crowd that had already, visibly, begun to drift a polite half-step away from her, the way crowds do when they've decided, collectively and without discussion, who tonight's story belongs to and who has simply been written out of it. Across the room, Duke Bartholomew Winslow had watched the entire exchange from beside a pillar, glass of wine forgotten in his hand. He had come to this ball fully intending to bask in his eldest daughter's rise, to accept the congratulations of men who'd never once thought to congratulate him on her existence before. He hadn't expected to watch her dismantle a woman twice her social standing with nothing but a folded piece of paper and a voice that never once rose above conversational. Something in his expression watching her looked almost like the beginning of an apology he didn't yet have the words for. Henrietta appeared at his elbow before he could decide whether to approach his own daughter. Remarkable, isn't she? The Dowager Duchess said, not quite a question. I hadn't realized, Bartholomew said slowly, that she'd grown into someone capable of that. She didn't grow into it tonight, Your Grace. Henrietta's voice carried the particular gentleness of a woman delivering an unwelcome truth. She's likely been capable of it for years. You simply never gave her a room in which to prove it. Bartholomew had no answer for that. He drank the rest of his wine instead, and said nothing further to anyone for the remainder of the evening. The second piece of news reached the ballroom less than an hour later, and it arrived the way scandal always seemed to travel fastest, breathless, secondhand, delivered by someone who clearly relished being the one to say it first. Have you heard about the Kestrel marriage? Theodora caught the fragment from two women near the refreshment table, and something in her chest went cold before she'd even understood why. Kestrel. That was her sister's married name now. Cassandra had married Lord Julian Kestrel 8 months prior, in a ceremony so lavish the newspapers had called it the wedding of the season, and Theodora, uninvited to nearly every family gathering since her own wedding, had read about it in exactly the same papers as everyone else. She turned toward the women before she could stop herself. Forgive me, she said. What about the Kestrel marriage? The taller woman's eyebrows lifted with obvious delight at having an audience who didn't already know. You haven't heard? Lord Kestrel's fortune collapsed entirely, some fraudulent investment scheme. Apparently, his partner vanished with the funds months ago. And Lady Kestrel, she lowered her voice with theatrical relish, was discovered in the company of Lord Sylvester Crane. Discovered quite thoroughly from what I understand. Theodora felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. Lord Kestrel is filing for divorce, the woman continued, clearly enjoying herself. Publicly. Tonight's the first the wider circle has heard of it, though apparently half the county's known for weeks. Theodora excused herself before the woman could finish savoring the details, moving quickly toward the terrace doors, needing air, needing a moment where her face didn't have to arrange itself into something acceptable for public consumption. Cassandra, beautiful, cruel, endlessly certain of her own superior choices, was standing somewhere in this same county tonight, watching everything she'd built collapse in front of the same society that had once fawned over her wedding gown. Theodora pressed her hand against the cold stone balustrade and made herself breathe. She should feel satisfied. She realized that distantly, with something like alarm at her own reaction. Cassandra had mocked her. For a decade had stood in doorways saying move, had laughed with strangers at her expense, had watched her get excluded from a family portrait without once objecting. This should feel like justice. Instead, it just felt like watching someone she used to love fall. She would learn the rest of it later. Secondhand, in pieces how Julian Kestrel had discovered the affair not through some dramatic confrontation, but through a valet's quiet loyalty and a single letter left carelessly in a writing desk. How Cassandra had spent the final weeks of her marriage watching servants leave one by one as the money dried up, the same servants who'd once curtsied to her without being asked. How she'd stood in the entrance hall of Kestrel House, the night the divorce papers were formally served, in a gown she could no longer afford to have properly cleaned, and understood for the first time in her life what it felt like to have a room go silent around her for reasons that had nothing to do with admiration. Theodora didn't know any of that yet, standing on the terrace with the cold air working its way through her gown. She only knew the shape of the feeling in her own chest, and that it surprised her by refusing to be simple. You've heard, Leopold said quietly, appearing beside her at the railing. The whole room's heard. Theodora's voice came out smaller than she intended. They're saying it like it's entertainment, like it's a play they paid to watch. Are you enjoying it? He asked, careful. Not accusing, genuinely uncertain of the answer. No, The word surprised her, coming out immediate and honest. I keep waiting to enjoy it. Everyone would understand if I did. God knows she never once. She stopped herself, started again. But I just keep picturing her standing in some cold drawing room, completely alone, finding out in real time that beauty and cruelty were never actually going to be enough. Leopold said nothing, just waited, the way he'd learned to, whenever she was working her way toward something true. I know what that feels like, Theodora said quietly, being the person the whole room is quietly discussing. I've lived inside that feeling for years. And I don't care how she treated me, I wouldn't wish that particular kind of alone on anyone. She wrote the letter that same night, before she could talk herself out of it, sitting at the small writing desk in her chambers, while the ball's music still drifted faintly through the walls below. She crossed out the first 3 attempts. Dear Cassandra, I heard what happened tonight. Too formal, too distant, the kind of sentence a stranger writes. Cassandra, I know we have never been close. Worse. That read like an accusation dressed up as an opening line. She sat for a long moment, pen hovering, watching the candle gutter slightly in the draft. Then she simply wrote what was true. I heard tonight. I imagine half the kingdom has heard by now, and I imagine that's the worst part of it, not the ending of a marriage, but the audience watching it end. I remember what that felt like, though our circumstances were never the same. I am not writing to gloat, and I am not writing because I expect anything from you in return. I am only writing because you are still my sister, and because I don't believe anyone should have to sit alone with something like this. If you would like company, or simply quiet, or nothing at all, Ashworth Manor's doors are open to you. Theodora. She read it twice, sealed it before she could unwrite it a 3rd time. Forgiveness, she was learning, was rarely a single grand gesture, arriving at the perfect dramatic moment. Usually it was smaller than that. Usually it was just one person deciding quietly to go first. She didn't tell Leopold what the letter said until after it had already gone. When she finally showed him, he read it once, then looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as entirely particular to him, not surprise, precisely, but a kind of quiet reassessment, as though he were revising upward. Yet again, whatever ceiling he'd assumed her capacity for grace might have. Most women in your position would have let her sit with it, he said. A year of silence would hardly have been unreasonable, after everything. Probably not, Theodora agreed, but I've had a great deal of practice sitting alone with things nobody thought to soften for me. I decided some time ago that I'd rather be the kind of person who softens it for someone else, even someone who never once did the same for me. Otherwise, what was the entire decade for? He didn't have an answer for that either. He simply took her hand, and they sat together in the quiet a while longer, listening to the last of the ball's music fade somewhere beyond the walls. News from Winslow Hall reached them differently through Reginald, who arrived at Ashworth Manor, 11 days later, hat in hand, looking like a man who'd aged considerably more than the months actually allowed for. Father sent me, he said, standing awkwardly in the drawing room, not quite meeting Theodora's eyes, though I suspect he was too proud to come himself, or too ashamed. I've honestly stopped being able to tell the difference. Sit down, Reginald. Theodora gestured to the chair across from her. You look like you haven't slept in a week. I haven't. He sat heavily. The estate's finances are Theodora. They're worse than we let ourselves believe for years. Father spent more on appearances than the land could ever actually support. He stopped, pressed his palms against his knees. I made it worse. The horse breeding ventures. I was so certain I understood what I was doing. And now? Now creditors call daily. We've lost half the household staff, not dismissed, Theodora, they left, because we stopped being able to pay them. The tenant farms haven't seen proper repairs in 3 years. His voice cracked slightly. I came to ask for help, which is, I imagine, the single most humiliating sentence I've ever had to say out loud. Theodora studied her brother for a long moment. The same brother who, years ago in the practice yard, had told her he'd build her a cottage far enough away that visitors wouldn't need to know they were related. What about the tenants? She asked finally. Reginald blinked, clearly having expected a different question first. What? The families on the land. The ones actually growing the harvest, raising the livestock, keeping the estate breathing. Who's looking after them while you and father sort out your pride? Silence, which told her everything. Reginald's shoulders dropped, some tension in them finally releasing, though he still looked braced for refusal. I told father you'd likely turn us away, that we'd earned nothing less. I considered it, Theodora admitted. For about the length of time it took me to remember that Tint and staff don't deserve to starve for my father's pride, whatever I decide about him personally. I'll help, she said slowly, but not the way you're imagining. Not simply money handed over to disappear into the same mismanagement that caused all of this. Then how? You and father will come here. Both of you. You'll work alongside my estate manager, learn precisely how a household is actually run, and once you understand it, truly understand it, not simply nod along pretending to, you'll go back and rebuild Winslow Hall yourselves. With my resources, under my terms. Reginald stared at her. You want us to work. Like laborers. I want you to understand what you nearly destroyed, Theodora said, before I let either of you touch it again. He was quiet a long moment. Then, slowly, something shifted in his face, not resistance, but something closer to relief, like a man finally being handed instructions after years of drowning without them. All right, he said quietly. All right. We'll come. It will take some months to settle here, though creditors to satisfy first, staff to release properly rather than simply abandon, the horses to sell before they cost us anything further. I won't pretend we can simply walk away from Winslow Hall tomorrow. Take the time you need to do it honestly, Theodora said. I'd rather you arrived in winter having done it properly than arrived tomorrow having left a mess behind you. He nodded, then paused at the door, hand on the frame, not quite turning back. Theodora, his voice was rough years ago. In the practice yard, I told you that when I inherited the title, I'd build you a cottage. Somewhere far enough that visitors wouldn't need to know we were related. He swallowed hard. I've thought about that sentence more than you'd believe, these past months. I meant it as some kind of kindness at the time. I understand now what it actually was. I remember it exactly, she said. I stood at that fence a long while after you walked off. I don't think you ever noticed. I didn't. He looked, for a moment, genuinely stricken by that. I don't remember much of anything from those years, except my own fencing scores, if I'm honest. Which is precisely the problem, isn't it? I had the luxury of forgetting things that you had to carry. I was cruel to you long before I understood what cruelty actually cost people. I'm sorry. I don't expect that to undo anything. It doesn't, she said honestly. But it's a start. He nodded, and left, and Theodora sat alone in the drawing room for a long while afterward, watching the candlelight move across walls that had somehow, slowly, over the better part of a year, become the first walls that had ever truly felt like hers. Outside, the autumn wind moved through gardens where she'd once climbed through a window to feed a stranger, never once imagining it would lead here to a husband who believed her without question, a grandmother who'd become like a second mother, and a family finally, painfully, beginning to understand the cost of everything they'd once thrown away. The reply from Cassandra arrived 3 days later. Short, unsteady handwriting, nothing like her sister's usual elegant script. I don't know how to accept kindness from you. I'm not certain I know how to accept it from anyone right now, but I would like to try if the offer still stands. Theodora held the letter for a long time before she answered it. Then she picked up her pen and began to write back. The months that followed moved more slowly than the drama of that single evening might have suggested, which was, Theodora had come to realize, generally how real change worked. There were no more grand confrontations to stage, no more evidence to gather. There was only the long, unglamorous work of two proud men learning to settle their debts honestly, and a sister learning to sit with the wreckage of a marriage she'd built on exactly the wrong foundation, and a duchess quietly managing all of it from a house that had somehow, without her quite noticing when it happened, become the place everyone in her family now turned to first. It took a full 6 months before either Winslow man actually arrived at Ashworth Manor's gates, ready to do the work. Theodora had demanded of them 6 months of selling off carriages and jewelry that no longer served any purpose beyond appearances, of settling the more aggressive creditors before the gentler ones, of writing to tenant families directly to promise repairs were coming, even if neither man could yet say exactly when. Theodora received occasional letters during those months, brief and businesslike. Reginald reporting progress the way a soldier might report troop movements this creditor satisfied. That stable sold. So many staff members compensated for wages owed before they'd been permitted to leave with any dignity intact. She read each one carefully and answered each one plainly, offering neither excessive warmth nor withheld approval, simply the steady, even attention she'd have given any tenant working through a difficult harvest. By the time winter finally delivered both men to Ashworth Manor's gates, hats in hand and considerably thinner than pride alone could explain, both of them looked like men who had already done a great deal of quiet, private suffering before ever setting foot on Theodora's land, which was, she suspected, precisely the point. Winter arrived early that year, and with it came Duke Bartholomew Winslow and his son, standing in Ashworth Manor's stable yard in coats too fine for the work Theodora had assigned them, looking like men who'd forgotten how their own hands functioned for anything beyond holding a teacup. "You want me to muck out stalls," Bartholomew said slowly, staring at the shovel Theodora's estate manager had just placed in his gloved hands. "Personally, I want you to understand," Theodora said, "precisely what it takes to run land you've spent 30 years assuming ran itself." That was the agreement. Not charity. Not forgiveness handed over like a gift that cost her nothing. Labor. Real labor. Beside the people whose wages had gone unpaid for months, while her father commissioned another portrait, another ballroom's worth of candles, another evening designed entirely around how the Winslow name would look to people who never once asked what it cost. Bartholomew looked at the shovel, looked at his son, looked, finally, at his eldest daughter, standing in a stable yard in a plain wool coat, entirely unbothered by the cold, entirely unmoved by his discomfort. "Your mother would have found this very funny," he said quietly. "My mother," Theodora said, "would have found it long overdue." He didn't argue. It was, she noted silently, the first time in her entire life he hadn't. Reginald took to the physical work more readily than his father did, in the way younger men often adapt faster to having their pride dismantled. Within a month he was rising before dawn without being asked, working alongside the stable hands as though he'd been born to it, rather than merely inheriting the right to ignore it. Theodora's estate manager, a plain-spoken man named Mr. Croft, who had never once been intimidated by a title, reported to her privately that her brother asked more useful questions in a single week than most young lords managed in a lifetime. "He wants to understand it properly," Croft told her, "not simply appear to. There's a difference, and I've rarely seen a young man of his station bother learning it." Theodora took the report without comment, though she felt something loosen quietly in her chest. At hearing it, the same something she suspected that had loosened the day, Reginald finally apologized for the cottage. The months that followed were slower than any climax deserved to be, and Theodora found she preferred it that way. Real change, she was learning, rarely announced itself with trumpets. It looked like her father, hands blistered, learning to walk a tenant's fence line, and actually listen when the farmer explained what the land needed, instead of what looked impressive in a ledger. It looked like Reginald, 3 months in, sitting up half the night with a sick foal because he'd finally learned an animal's suffering didn't care about a man's title. It looked like small, unglamorous Tuesdays, repeated until they became a pattern instead of a performance. There were setbacks, of course. Bartholomew's pride flared more than once, particularly the week a visiting lord recognized him mucking out a stall and made no effort to hide his amusement. Theodora found her father afterward, jaw tight, ready to abandon the whole arrangement rather than endure being laughed at by his own peers. "Let them laugh," she told him plainly. "You spent 30 years laughing at people for having less than you did. I imagine this is simply the accounting coming due." He hadn't liked hearing it. He'd stayed anyway. Cassandra visited in early spring. Alone. No maid, no carriage grand enough to announce her, just a plain hired cart, and a woman who'd clearly spent the winter learning what it felt like to be looked past instead of looked at. She found Theodora in the garden, kneeling beside a rose bed that wouldn't bloom again until summer. I didn't know if you'd want to see me, Cassandra said. I wrote to you first. I think that answers your question. Cassandra sat carefully on the low stone wall nearby, hands folded in her lap, none of the old performance left in her posture. I've spent months trying to understand how I became the person who did what I did. To Tobias. To you long before that, her voice caught. I used to tell myself I chose happiness while you chose security. I actually believed that. And now I understand I never once chose anything. I simply took whatever made me look the most impressive to whoever was watching. She looked down at her hands. I don't know how to be a person who isn't being watched, Theodora. I'm having to learn from nothing. Theodora set down her trowel. Studied her sister really studied her, the way she hadn't allowed herself to in years, not through the old lens of every cruelty stacked up between them, but simply as a woman, lost, finally honest about it. That's a start, she said. Most people never get that far. Cassandra's eyes filled, and she didn't bother hiding it, which was, Theodora realized, possibly the first unguarded thing she'd ever watched her sister do. I'm not asking you to forgive me today, Cassandra said. Good, Theodora said, because I don't think I'm quite there yet either. Something passed between them then, not resolution, not the tidy bow a lesser story might have tied on it. Just an honest beginning, which Theodora had come to believe was worth considerably more. Cassandra stayed 3 days that visit, and returned again the following month, and the month after that, each time a little steadier, a little less like a woman performing recovery, and a little more like one actually living it. She began helping in small ways. Nobody asked her to help with reading to the tenant children, on the days Theodora was occupied with accounts, mending linens alongside the junior staff without once mentioning that she'd never held a needle before her 20th year. Nobody made a ceremony of it. It simply became true, the way most real change did, one unremarkable afternoon at a time. On such visit, Cassandra found Theodora going over the school's early architectural plans, sketched out across the drawing room table, and lingered over them a long while before speaking. You're building something for girls like the tenant children, she said slowly. Not girls like me. I'm building something for girls like both of us, Theodora corrected. You were taught that beauty was the only currency worth having, just as thoroughly as I was taught. Mine was worthless. Neither lesson did either of us any good. Cassandra was quiet a long moment, tracing a finger along the edge of the drawing. I'd like to help, if you'll let me. I don't know the first thing about running a school, but I know a great deal about exactly the kind of vanity it ought to teach girls to survive. Theodora studied her sister, and for the first time in years, felt no old wound flare at the sight of her. Then teach them that, she said. It might be the most useful thing either of us ever does with what we learned in that house. She found the answer to the locket by accident, the way she seemed to find every important thing in her life. It was Henrietta who noticed the mechanism, turning the small object over in candlelight one evening, while Theodora described, for the dozenth time, her frustration at never managing to open it. This isn't a simple clasp, Henrietta said, holding it closer to the flame. This is a banker's lock. I've seen exactly one before, on a document case belonging to my own late husband. She looked up. Your mother didn't hide a keepsake in here, my dear. She hid something she wanted protected. They found the key 3 days later, in the same attic trunk where Theodora had discovered the unfinished portrait, tucked into the lining of an old shawl that had somehow impossibly survived a decade of neglect. The locket opened with a small, satisfying click. Inside, folded impossibly small, was a document bearing her mother's maiden signature and a sum of money large enough to make Theodora sit down hard on the attic floor. This was her mother's dowry. The full dowry, undisturbed, quietly used the document, made clear in careful, precise handwriting, to settle a catastrophic debt her father had accumulated in the earliest years of their marriage, long before Theodora was born. A debt that would have cost the Winslow family their entire estate. Rosamond Winslow had saved her husband's family from ruin, quietly, without ever once being credited for it, and Bartholomew Proud, image-obsessed Bartholomew, had apparently spent the following decades unable to forgive his own wife for having been the one who'd rescued him. It explained. Theodora realized with a slow, cold understanding so much more than she'd ever wanted to know. A man who couldn't bear being saved by a woman, had raised a daughter he decided, from birth, wasn't allowed to outshine anyone, had painted her out of a portrait rather than face what her existence might have someday reminded him of. She brought the document to her father herself, watched his face as he read it. He didn't speak for a long time. She never told me she'd kept proof, he said finally, voice unsteady. She kept quite a lot of things quiet, Theodora said. It seems to run in the family. Bartholomew looked up at her, and for the first time in her entire life, Theodora watched her father's composure completely break. I built an entire life, he said, around never having to admit your mother saved us. And somewhere in that, I convinced myself the daughter who looked so much like her couldn't be allowed to outshine me either. He pressed the document against his chest, like something that might still burn him. I am so sorry, Theodora, for longer than you'll ever know. She didn't answer right away. Forgiveness, she reminded herself again, wasn't a single sentence. It was a season, sometimes several. Plant something for her, she said finally. In the garden here. Something that blooms every spring, where you'll actually have to look at it. He nodded, unable to speak, and that, Theodora decided, was enough for one afternoon. He planted white roses along the eastern wall the following week, working the soil himself despite Reginald's offer to do it for him, refusing help the way a man refuses help with the one task he actually needs to do alone. By midsummer they had taken, small and stubborn against the stone, and Bartholomew took to walking past them each morning on his way to the stables, though he never once mentioned doing so, and Theodora never once asked him to. Leopold found her in the drawing room one evening in early summer, staring at a large object draped in canvas that had arrived that morning under conditions of considerable secrecy. You've been suspiciously quiet about a delivery, she said. I have, Leopold. Patience, he said, was never something you were particularly good at. I've noticed. She swatted his arm, though she was smiling, and together they pulled the canvas free. It was a portrait, new, freshly painted, in the same style as the one that still hung, unaltered, at Winslow Hall, except this one held 4 figures instead of 3. Bartholomew, Reginald, Cassandra, and Theodora standing exactly where she should have stood a decade ago, painted with the same care, the same light, as every other face in the frame. She stood in front of it for a long moment, unable to speak. I commissioned it after the ball, Leopold admitted quietly. After, Delphine. I kept thinking about the version you found in the attic, the one where you'd been painted over. I wanted there to be one, somewhere in this world, where that never happened at all. Leopold, I know it doesn't undo anything, he said quickly, almost nervous, which she'd rarely seen from him. I know a painting can't erase a decade of. It's perfect, she said, voice breaking slightly. It's absolutely perfect. They hung it in the Ashworth Manor entrance hall that same week, where every visitor who entered would see it first, before anything else in the house. Nobody who saw it ever asked why the eldest daughter looked so at home in the frame. She simply did. Her father asked to see it when he heard. He stood before it a long while, silent, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than Theodora had ever heard it. I owe your husband a debt I don't know how to repay, he said. For painting what I refuse to, then don't repay it, Theodora said. Just don't ever paint anyone out again. That's the only debt that matters. The school opened in late summer, on a stretch of land Theodora had purchased herself, funded by her own household accounts, built for children whose families couldn't otherwise afford tutors or letters or the particular kind of future that came from knowing how to read a ledger before someone else decided to steal from you. She named it for her mother, the Rosamond Winslow School for Girls, carved simply into stone above the front door, no embellishment required. The dedication drew half the county tenant families, kitchen staff misses. Bellwether in her Sunday best, Henrietta seated proudly in the front row, even Bartholomew and Reginald, standing quietly near the back, no longer needing to be seen, simply wanting to witness. Mrs. Bellwether, 70 now, and stubbornly refusing to retire from her kitchen, had insisted on baking for the occasion herself, 3 long tables of it laid out beneath the new building's windows. You'll not open a school for hungry girls, she'd told Theodora firmly, without at least one proper meal to start them off right. Theodora hadn't argued. She never had, where Mrs. Bellwether's cooking was concerned, and saw no reason to start now. Cassandra stood beside Theodora at the ribbon, the two sisters closer that afternoon than they'd been in 15 years, though neither of them announced it. They simply stood together, which, after everything, said more than any speech could have. Theodora spoke briefly. Simply, "My mother spent the last hours of her life teaching me something," she said, voice carrying clear across the crowd. "That the world would look at my face long before it bothered looking at my heart, and that I was never, under any circumstance, to let it win that argument. I want every girl who walks through these doors to grow up already knowing that, without needing 10 years and a stranger in a garden to teach her the way I did." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the crowd at that those who knew the story, at least in part. She cut the ribbon. The doors opened. Children ran through them laughing, and for a moment Theodora simply stood and watched, overwhelmed by something she didn't have an immediate word for. Then Leopold was beside her, taking her hand. "Walk with me," he said. They moved away from the crowd, toward the edge of the school's new gardens, where the noise softened into birdsong, and the late afternoon light turned everything gold, exactly the way it had the very first night they'd met. He stopped, turned to face her fully. "I burned nothing this time," he said, and Theodora laughed, soft and sudden, because she understood exactly which fire he meant. The study, the 1-year contract, folded away since the night before their wedding. The ash she'd found in the hearth the following morning and never once mentioned aloud, because some proofs of love don't need to be spoken of to be believed. There's nothing left in any drawer to burn. There hasn't been for over a year now. Only you. "We finish, please?" He took both her hands. "I want to ask you properly this time. No arrangement. No practical solution to two people's separate problems, and no contract left to dissolve if either of us wanted an exit. Just you, Theodora Winslow. The only honest conversation I had that entire ball, and every single day since." He knelt right there in the garden, in front of tenant families and kitchen staff, and a grandmother wiping her eyes without any attempt at subtlety. "Will you marry me?" he said again. "Properly. For no reason except that I love you." Theodora looked at him, really looked, the way she'd looked at him that very first night, searching, half expecting some catch she'd somehow missed. She never found one. She never would. "Yes," she said, and this time when she said it, the whole garden erupted into applause, loud enough to send birds scattering from the trees. Years passed the way years do quietly, in the accumulation of ordinary days that somehow, looking back, added up to an entire life. The school grew, adding a second building within 3 years, then a third, until the Rosamund Winslow School for Girls had become one of the few institutions in the kingdom where a tenant farmer's daughter and a minor lord's daughter sat at the same desk, learning the same lessons, judged by the same standard. Cassandra taught there twice a week eventually, a subject she'd insisted on calling conversation, which turned out to mean teaching girls how to hold their own in a room full of people who'd already decided what they were worth before they'd spoken a word, a subject. As it happened, she understood better than almost anyone alive. Reginald married a tenant's daughter 3 years after that first winter of hard labor, a plain-spoken young woman named Margaret, who had, by all accounts, refused him twice before finally accepting, on the condition that he never again referred to farm work as beneath him. Bartholomew walked her down the aisle himself, having grown fond of her long before his son had worked up the courage to court her properly, and cried more openly at that wedding than anyone in the family had ever seen him cry at anything. He lived long enough, in the years that followed, to walk his own granddaughter down the very garden path, where he'd once refused to let his eldest daughter stand in a family portrait, and never once, in all the years afterward, mentioned that old portrait again without also mentioning the one that had replaced it. Theodora herself grew older the way strong women do, softer in some places, sharper in others, entirely unbothered by a mirror that would have once made a 13-year-old girl brace for cruelty. It was autumn again many years later, when she found herself walking past the schoolyard and heard something that stopped her cold. A group of girls laughing at another girl standing alone near the fence, round-faced, quiet, clutching a book against her chest like a shield. "You should just eat less," one of the girls said, not particularly cruel in her own mind, simply repeating something she'd overheard somewhere, the way children do. Then maybe you wouldn't look so. That's quite enough, Theodora said, and her voice, even after all these years, still carried the particular stillness that made people listen. The girls scattered, embarrassed, the way children always do when caught. The round-faced girl remained, eyes down, clearly braced for whatever came next. Theodora knelt in front of her. Slowly, carefully. "Look at me," she said gently. The girl did, wary, the way Theodora herself once had been. "Someone very important once told me something," Theodora said, "when I was not much older than you, and I've spent my whole life since making sure it was true. Would you like to hear it?" The girl nodded, small and uncertain. Theodora took the girl's hands in her own hands that had once climbed through a kitchen window, once vanquished a decade-old lie in a crowded ballroom, once opened a locked locket to uncover a truth an entire family had buried. "Never," she said softly, "let anyone convince you your heart is worth less than your face." The girl's eyes filled, the way eyes do when they hear something they didn't know they'd been waiting their whole life to be told. Theodora smiled the same smile that had once won over a duke in a moonlit garden, that had once made an entire kitchen staff call her simply ours instead of the new duchess, and helped the girl to her feet. Some stories, she'd learned, were never really about the ballroom, or the wealth, or even the marriage. They were about one person finally being seen, and then choosing, deliberately, to pass that seeing on to someone else. The garden gate creaked closed behind them as they walked back toward the schoolhouse. Together, two generations of the same quiet truth carried forward one more time.